Arizona State can still get to a Big 12 championship, but the path is pretty convoluted. Erik Ruby and Anthony Totri here to break it down. Totri, the first thing that pops to my mind is every other team has to lose every game to the worst team going throughout the rest of the season. Pretty easy, huh?
So it's not even that has to happen, but one thing that definitely has to get done if the Sun Devils want to take advantage of the sliver of a hope that they do have to make the Big 12 championship. Something that's not a negotiable thing here is Arizona State has to win their next 3 games. They have to beat West Virginia, they have to beat Colorado, and they have to beat Arizona. If they drop any of the games in between there, then that sliver of a hope completely evaporates. You don't necessarily need all the other teams to drop to their worst opponent, but you absolutely need the Sun Devils to win out. Now, taking a look at those Big 12 standings where Arizona State sits at number 6 right now, the teams above them include Utah, Houston, Cincinnati, Texas Tech, and BYU. So if the season were to end right now, it would be BYU and Texas Tech playing for the Big 12 championship game in Dallas. Now, something that hurts Arizona State is they do have those losses to Houston and Utah. Both those teams, like I said, both sit above them in the Big 12 standing. So how does ASU actually make the Big 12 championship? Well, the most likely scenario is, of course, Arizona State goes 3-0 in their next 3 games. They need Utah to drop one more game. They need Houston to drop one more game. That in and of itself would mean if Arizona State won out and those 2 teams lost, Houston and Utah would have 3 conference losses to ASU's 2. So the head-to-head tiebreaker would not mean anything. That would leave Cincinnati, Texas Tech, and BYU above Arizona State. Now, we know ASU has the head-to-head tiebreaker over Texas Tech because the Sun Devils beat Texas Tech when they were in Tempe, when Tech was the number 7 team in the country. Now, a number of these teams still play each other. BYU still plays Texas Tech. They actually play this weekend in Lubbock. It's going to be a college game day game. All eyes going to be on the number 8 team versus the number 9 team in college football. And BYU actually plays Cincinnati. Cincinnati, fresh off their first conference loss of the season this past weekend, they got stomped by Utah. So if you're an ASU fan, who are you rooting for? Well, there's a couple different scenarios, but again, the most likely scenario that you'd be rooting for outside of Utah and Houston still dropping a game is you're rooting for BYU to win both of those games. You're rooting for BYU to beat Texas Tech, and you're rooting for BYU to beat Cincinnati at this point in the year. That would leave BYU as an unbeaten, assuming they win out and win their next few games of the year. Tech would have 2 conference losses, but they wouldn't have the tiebreaker over ASU because, as we mentioned earlier, the Sun Devils beat them straight up. They have the head-to-head. Cincinnati at that point would have 2 conference losses to ASU's 2 conference losses. And then, of course, win percentages, common opponents, all that stuff eventually shake out the way it does. And if you want to completely bypass any sort of tiebreaker situation, well, then you need BYU to beat Texas Tech and Cincinnati, and you need Cincinnati to drop another game on their schedule. They have Arizona, BYU, and TCU the rest of the way. So 2 of those 3, with one of them being BYU, that would get Arizona State in among all of the other things that we had mentioned. And pretty much if you're an Arizona State fan the rest of the way, if you're rooting for one other team outside of Arizona State, you're rooting for TCU. TCU the rest of the season, in fact, plays a good chunk of the upper echelon of this conference in terms of the standings. TCU still has yet to play Iowa State this year. That doesn't really make a difference in terms of where these teams are going to be at in terms of Big 12 championship. But after that, they got BYU, they got Houston, and they have Cincinnati. In a perfect world, similar to 2024 when ASU needed help and they relied on Jalen Daniels and the Kansas Jayhawks, well, all ASU fans should be rooting for Josh Hoover and TCU the rest of the way if you're looking for Arizona State, again, to capitalize on that sliver of a hope of going to Dallas and potentially repeating as Big 12 champions in 2025.
Yeah, and when you look at Utah's schedule and these teams that you need to have extra losses from, they play Baylor. I think Utah has definitely shown that they're a better team than Baylor, but that's on the road in Waco. They host Kansas State, who's been pesky in the Big 12 so far, but again, just got blown out by Texas Tech, an upper echelon team in this conference. And then they're on the road at Kansas. So as Arizona State fans, you'll be rooting for Kansas yet again at the end of a season, but Kansas has not been putting together a great season, but this is where they kind of turned it on last year as well. When you look at Houston, obviously you mentioned they played TCU. That's in a couple of weeks. They're at UCF first, so that's going to be a game where Houston, fresh off of losing to a bottom of the barrel conference team in West Virginia, I would be shocked if they went out and dropped one, even though it's on the road to UCF, but we have seen that they've lost to a lower end team in this conference before, and then they play Baylor the final week of the season. So you're rooting for TCU and you're rooting for Baylor. Plus, I mean, you're rooting for some of these lower echelon teams in the Big 12 as well.
And UCF is actually currently the betting favorite to beat Houston this week. So if you are looking for maybe a sign of things to come, if you're looking for, the sunshine shining down from the heavens to Tempe, maybe that's your sign that UCF is favored over Willie Fritz's Houston Cougars. And then, of course, we'll see what goes down in Lubbock between BYU and Texas Tech. This isn't necessarily the only scenario where Arizona State makes the Big 12 championship, but looking at all the different scenarios, this one does feel like it is the most likely, if there were going to be a, quote, most likely, with 3 regular season games left in the season for Arizona State when you're currently sitting at 6th place in the conference.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you looked at it last year around this time, how likely was it that Arizona State made the Big 12 championship then, right? But the most important thing was they took care of business, and the end of season schedule for Arizona State is much easier than it was at the end of last year. Realistically speaking, though, if we get to this weekend and Texas Tech beats BYU, they then play UCF and on the road against West Virginia. If Texas Tech wins this weekend, it doesn't make it impossible, but does that pretty much put the nail in the coffin? Because there's really, I don't see any way that they lose to either UCF or West Virginia.
So if Texas Tech does, in fact, beat BYU this weekend, it makes things a little bit more challenging because you would still need BYU to drop another game to this point in the year. Again, the most likely situation is if Texas Tech were to beat BYU, then you would need BYU to lose to TCU the following week as well, which again, TCU has been a relatively hot and cold team to this point in the season. They're actually right below ASU in the standings, and we know this conference is full of parity. Anything can happen. But if that is the case, again, you need BYU to drop the following game to TCU because of, common opponents. When it's all said and done, if these two teams are tied, BYU and Arizona State, that is at the end of the year in terms of common, win percentage against common opponents, ASU beat Texas Tech and they beat TCU. So in theory, you definitely want TCU to beat BYU the following week. Again, that way you have a much higher percentage than BYU does against common opponents.
I know that the odds for this, realistically speaking, are really low. If you had to put the Totri odds on ASU finding a way to make it back to the Big 12 championship, what would you put them at?
I would probably say about 5%. Because not only do you need about 5-6 other things to happen over the course of the next 4 weeks, you also need to take care of business. And I get Arizona State has their easiest 3-game stretch that they've had all year since maybe the start of the year, right? They've got West Virginia, Colorado, and Arizona. You still have been beaten up with injuries, right? Sam Leavitt done for the year. It's Jeff Sims starting at quarterback for the Sun Devils. Now, I know he got a big road win against Iowa State this past weekend. We'll see if they can keep it up following the bye week, but it's not just Jeff Sims dealing with injuries, right? We'll see if they get Prince Dorba, potentially Tate Romney back against West Virginia. It doesn't look like Kyson Brown will be back the rest of the season, a backup running back for ASU. We haven't seen much Kanye Udo at all, really, over the last several weeks of the season. JT, Jordyn Tyson, still not expected to return against West Virginia, maybe Colorado. So all of these things need to happen, and Arizona State needs to take care of business despite dealing with a ton of injuries. So it is certainly going to be an uphill battle. If I had to give it a percentage, I'd say probably roughly between 3 and 5%.
So you're telling me there's a chance. That's all I need, Totri. Obviously, if you want to keep up to date with what Arizona State is doing through this bye week and through the final 3 weeks of the season, there's no better place than right here on PHNX Sun Devils and PHNX Sports. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button as well. And for all your Sun Devil news and notes, keep it tuned right here to PHNX Sun Devils.